Retirement readiness can be challenging enough without compounding that difficulty by making boneheaded retirement planning mistakes. Today we address 3 of these, which we'll summarize as misunderstanding reward and risk, retiring at the wrong time, and confusing your so-called retirement number with an actual retirement plan. Stay tuned as we delve more deeply into these 3 mistakes and how to avoid them right now on the Retirement Lifestyle Show.
Welcome to the Retirement Lifestyle Show. I'm your co-host, Roshan Loungani, here with Erik Olson and Adrian Nicholson. We've got a great episode today. Before we jump into it, Erik, you were driving across New York last week, correct?
Oh, yeah, that was fantastic. So we spent some time in the Adirondacks up at one of a lake called Long Lake, and it was just amazing there. And then did some hiking in the area. So that was my wife's and my first exposure to that park and those mountains. It was, I was expecting beautiful, but it was really beautiful. I thought I was thinking I would be seeing more jagged peaks, but instead what I discovered is the secret beauty of that is all the lakes. Have you guys been there before?
No, I haven't. I haven't been to New York in a while, and I want to go back, but sounds like you have a great time, Erik. I mean, you always have a good time. You got to go on a trip together sometime soon, Erik. I wish you could go to Vegas with me.
Oh, that would be so fun. Yeah, that would really be fun. Hey, in fact, because of, you've got a big event coming up later this fall. So I'm actually excited to getting out and seeing your city and hanging out with you guys a little bit.
That's awesome.
Well, less
Erik.
so maybe with you, Adrian, because you'll have a few things that'll be preoccupying you.
Yeah, but I'm definitely looking forward to Erik's referring to my wedding on October 29th. Less than 100 days. I'm just really excited. We're getting people RSVPing right now, so I'm really excited. A lot of people are taking their time to come celebrate me and my future wife, Alex. So I'm really excited.
Fantastic.
That's great. And Adrian, you're as far as planning goes, you're pretty much done, correct?
Yeah, we have everything booked up. Like I said, we're just kind of waiting for people to just respond to our invitation. So we're pretty much dialed in at this point, ready to go.
Neat.
That's great. Well, let's jump into our topic today. Adrian, you are taking the lead today, so I'm going to let you kick it off.
Great, thanks. I appreciate that, Roshan. So today we're going to have a lot of ideas for our listeners and our audience. So we're really excited to share some common retirement mistakes you should avoid. These can be common planning misconceptions, and we're just kind of run through a bunch of ideas that our audience and listeners should just really consider, or just think about when they're planning for their future. We think these are going to be some really good ones and helpful ones. And if you could take just a moment to like and subscribe our videos, we really appreciate it because we have a lot of good content for you today. So you guys ready to go?
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. So the first area I want to touch on today is risk and reward. I think this is a very valuable concept, especially in the space of investing. And I guess a common mistake that people can really run into is not settling into a level of risk that they're comfortable with. And the overall kind of thing I want to leave you with today is make sure that you're getting paid in line with the risk you're taking. This is extremely important. Whether you're an aggressive investor, a moderate investor, a conservative investor, if you're aiming for super high returns or moderate returns, you want to be paid in line with the amount of risk you're taking. So understanding the relationship between risk and reward can really help you better diversify your portfolio and really protect your overall investment, and is extremely important because there are a lot of risk associated with investing. Everybody understands that. If you want to achieve really high returns, if you want to really crank up your growth rate, there's going to be risk that is involved in this. There's the opportunity of you losing money, not keeping pace with inflation, because inflation's a really hot topic right now. People want to make sure that their money's keeping pace with this. Hitting on a required rate of return to meet your income needs in retirement. That's really important. Everybody has a certain number. They may not know what it is if you haven't planned, but everybody has a certain investment or growth rate that they need to hit in order for them to achieve their goals. And there's also fees and transaction costs that come with investment. And these are all just common risks that fall into the investing world that you need to really make note of. And I'm just really going to hit home on that quote that I bring up, getting paid in line with the risks that you're taking. Because if there's an opportunity for you to lower your risk and kind of still stay in line with your overall return on your investment, that's a really good opportunity, because maybe you don't need to take as much risk anymore because you've accumulated a lot of wealth over time. So I think this is a very good area to start off with. Do either of you want to comment on where we're starting off today?
Yeah, I love where you're starting off. I think it's really valuable. Um, you touched on two things really that come to mind. One is uh, the first being risk comfort level can change over time, as can the risk required to reach your goal. So I think one, reassessing your comfort level and reassessing the risk you need to take on an ongoing basis is a good thing. The other thing that stands out, you had mentioned getting paid for your risk. I'm actually in the middle of Charlie Munger's book. That's Warren Buffett's partner at Berkshire Hathaway, and I just finished the section where he talks about risk, and he really goes in depth about how the investment industry tries to use volatility as the risk measure and how flawed that is, right? Volatility is it going up and down, and his take on it, which I definitely agree with, is there are really two major risks: the risk of permanent loss of capital and the risk of inadequate returns. And now both of these can be impacted if you have not assessed your risk tolerance correctly or your portfolio's need. So you can get a permanent loss or an inadequate return. You can be right about an investment, right? But then it goes down in value. You're scared or not comfortable with that risk, and then you sell, causing a permanent loss. Fast forward, that investment recovers. So that's an issue. That situation in me, that example, when you either didn't adequately assess your risk tolerance or what you could comfortably handle in that case, or it could have been the portfolio, one or the other. But I think it's a very good one to start off the topic with,
Yeah.
Adrian. And there's so
Mhm.
much to go into
Yeah,
there.
thanks for sharing that. I'm really interested in it's a book, right? That you referred to. What's the name of the title again?
It is. I'm looking it up right now for you on my phone. It's Charlie. It's called Charlie Munger, The Complete Investor by Tren Griffin.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely have to look into that. I mean, it's really important and just brings up the idea of just risk capacity. That definitely changes over time, how much risk you can really take overall. And like I mentioned before, there are investments out there that are correlated, that move in line with each other, where they might have varying degrees of risk. So really running the numbers and analyzing different investments can be very beneficial, where you have something that could provide a good return, has good growth prospects, everything looks really positive. Let's just say if it's a company, and it could be less risky than maybe something that you own right now. So that's something that is something really to consider, because there's just a common misconception: oh, if I want to achieve high returns, I have to take high risk. And yes, that is the case most of the times, but there's also ways where you could just reduce your risk and still have a return that is in line with your goals. I think is valuable. But again, it causes you to do some research, analyzing, really just digging into the numbers, which can take time. But when it comes to losing money or not losing your principal, it's could be really valuable and help out in the long run. That's for sure.
Okay, I've got to just mention a couple other things here. I think one of the mistakes that people sometimes make is that they confuse individual security volatility with portfolio level volatility. The portfolio, while on the one hand, I agree with what Munger says, is it's a disservice to the investment community. In that sense, has done a disservice to investors by focusing on security level volatility as though that's risk, and misapplying that concept. And for our listeners, so it's the contrasting risk that Munger highlighted, that Roshan cited, specifically the loss of the risk of a permanent loss of capital. That is indeed a risk, but volatility inherent that is inherent and sort of a predictable element of certain sorts of asset classes is not in and of itself a risk of permanent loss of capital. And so I have clients that will at times say, I want to get rid of this particular holding. Well, why? Well, because it hasn't been doing very well in the last 3 months. Okay. So, yeah, it doesn't always do well. That's for sure. Long run, how does it do? I don't know. It seems like it's going down. Let's just get rid of it. Well, you've probably heard that played out in your own conversations with certain clients. I think what happens there is that you just trimmed out. If you remove that component from your portfolio because it happened to have been down over the last 3 months, you wind up with this problem of having owned something that has a long-term high expected return potentially. But in your case, you cycle through various things that have a long-term, reasonably high expected rate of return. But your experience, your investment experience as a result of those is on balance negative because your behavior recurrently is you bought them here and you sold them down there when it got a little uncomfortable. So instead, you should be focused on what contribution, if any, do they have to the portfolio, particularly if they're inversely correlated with the rest of the portfolio. They're doing their job. That their job in part is to dampen the overall volatility of the portfolio. And it may not seem like it when they're in that one of those down phases, but just sit tight and they'll probably come back and do their job eventually. Having said
Yeah,
that,
I mean, yeah, continue, Eric. I
okay,
just want to comment on one thing that you brought up, but I really like where you're headed right now.
okay. I mean, there's the oft-cited example. I think is, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Bill Miller, but I might be wrong. It's the CMG Focus Fund. So this is an example of this taken not just to the single security level, but the aggregation of a number of securities inside a mutual fund. If if I'm not mistaken, over a 15-year period that recently concluded, that was one of the strongest, if not the strongest performing mutual fund of all, at least of all the broadly diversified mutual funds. Nevertheless, the average investor's return in that fund was negative. How could that be? Because they were recurrently buying after it had been on a hot streak, thinking, "Man, this thing is fantastic," and then selling after it had one of its cold streaks and think this thing is a dog, and that you just do that same cycle over and over and over again. It's very destructive. So go ahead.
It just shows the value and the importance of just building, I say, like a team in this aspect when it comes to creating a portfolio, because the individual securities and what you own in your portfolio, everything in there has a certain role that it's going to play in helping you achieve your your goal or the return that you need. It's all really important. So whether it's performing well in a quarter or not performing well, just doing the research and analyzing and just seeing is it still maintaining and keeping that role and why it was introduced in the portfolio in the first place is really important. It just shows the value of having an investment in philosophy is very important because it can keep you from making kind of emotional or straying away from it and making those decisions other than it being based on numbers and your overall plan.
Yeah.
I think is something really valuable
I have
here.
one second thought, and this is a lot faster. And this is just a reaction to something that Roshan said, and that is that while again I agree with the premise that you cited from Charlie Munger that people mistake volatility of an instrument with some sort of fundamentally, they equate it with a loss of capital or the risk of a loss of capital. I agree with that. That is a mistake to do that. At the same time, I just want to highlight that there's a very big difference between the way in which we accept risk or volatility, those again distinguishing those two things, when we are in the accumulation phase versus when we're in the distribution phase. During the accumulation phase, it really doesn't matter how much volatility you have in your portfolio. The only thing that matters is what the long term and from an investment, from a financial return standpoint. There's many other things that matter about investing, but from a financial return standpoint, during the accumulation phase, it doesn't really matter if your portfolio is volatile. It just matters is what the final outcome is. But during a distribution phase, even volatility, distinct from risk of permanent loss of capital. Even volatility is not your friend, because if you're taking money out on a steady basis in the same way that you were putting it in, let's say on a dollar cost averaging basis, this reverse dollar cost averaging from your portfolio, if it's too volatile, is quite damaging to the long-term survivability of that portfolio.
Yeah, and I think those are two different kinds
Mm-hmm.
of risk, right? When I was looking at the Munger quote, that's purely
Mm-hmm.
investment risk, whereas what you're describing, I'd call that more like
Yeah.
withdrawal risk,
Mm-hmm.
maybe, is probably the best way to define it. But yeah, there are definitely, uh, I would address that at the very beginning when Adrian had said, and I had echoed that how risk tolerance and capacity changes
Mm-hmm.
over time. Right. So I know there are a lot of different schools of thought. The most aggressive I think I've ever read was one that says keep 5 years of your withdrawals in really conservative investments, and then you can be as aggressive as you want with the rest. The thought being that the volatility over 5 years will smooth out. If it crashes, it'll come back within 5 years. And I've seen others where they talk about literally split your portfolio to where it's purely income generating, and you live off of that income and don't touch
Mm-hmm.
the principal. And others where they do sort of a hybrid where you've got both
Mm-hmm.
growth and income. I think any of these can make sense for the right
Mm-hmm.
person. So each individual's got to pick what works
Mm-hmm.
best for them. And Eric, we did an episode on this. I'm sure you'll remember the study more than I will. I think it was the glide path
Yes.
where it talked about increasing
Mm-hmm.
equity later on. Right? As far as you're withdrawing money, you're increasing equity along the way. Whereas typically the opposite is what is suggested.
Right.
So
Yeah,
um,
we'll put that.
not saying any of these are right or wrong, just saying an individual needs to select what makes the most sense for them, and their financial plan and overall financial situation will help give them guidance. It'll be a combination of data and comfort, both behavioral finance and financial plan. And I think that leads you to the correct answer for you.
Yeah. I have one last comment, Adrian, on the large question that you began with, which is risk and return.
Yeah, please go ahead,
I'm
Eric.
speaking about
Yeah.
books. Yeah, I'm reading a really interesting book by a guy who's one of the top researchers at AQR, Applied Quantitative Research, and I'm not sure that I'm 100%. I'm not 100% sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly, so I do apologize if I'm messing it up, but it's Antti Ilmanen, I believe is the name of it, Antti, if I'm recalling it correctly. Anyway, he has just published a book which was a sort of a follow up to the magnum opus that he had done back 10, 12 years ago, 550-page tome called Expected Returns. This time it's investing in an environment of low expected returns. And it is truly fascinating. So, if indeed his premise is correct that we are now coming into an extended period of lower expected returns on all sorts of instruments, stocks, bonds, and more, then Adrian, your counsel to us and to our listeners to be very mindful of what's going on the reward side along with the risk is all the more apropos.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Really appreciate you sharing that. And I really enjoy where our discussion went with risk and reward. I just thought it was just really valuable concept for our listeners just to be aware of, especially as the years go on. It's just something to always go back on an annual basis and just check in on because it's extremely important. So I'm gonna change gears here. As I was preparing for the podcast yesterday, I found a really interesting statistic that I wanted to share today that I think will lead into a pretty good discussion. So, according to the Federal Reserve Board, a study shows that 1/3 of those who retire eventually reverse retirement and return to work on either a full or part-time basis. And this is across multiple different income groups. I found this really interesting because it shows that there's a pretty much a 33% chance that the retirement party you're going to this weekend will just ultimately end up being a party. So I guess my biggest thing to the listener here, if you are planning on doing this, you should really consider taking your retirement for a test drive, which would be pretty important in my opinion. So what do you guys think of that stat?
Not surprised at all by it. I'll tell you, uh, here's what I have seen personally with some clients that have gone back to work, and honestly, in some cases, it was completely predictable. One is where people were laid off and they didn't retire by choice. They still got the retirement party because they were of age to retire, and at the time, maybe they are thinking they would be retiring, but then they go back to work because they really didn't want to retire at that point.
I
The
mean,
other
that's
thing I've
still nice that they got the party either way. That's very nice of them.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Once again, not always by choice. It's called a retirement, but it's a layoff. I have seen that. The other one
Oh,
though is and I like your advice with test driving a lot. With this, by the way, I've got a client doing this right now where they were
Oh,
able
that's
to cut
great.
back their work schedule so they can still work and then sort of test it out. And even during the pandemic, I had a client that was retiring and sort of got a forced test drive because of that. That's happened for people I've worked with during government shutdowns as well. So I love the test drive idea. But the other issue that comes up is a lot of people just don't know what to do when they retire. So
Hmm.
they
Yeah.
retire and they just end up bored. So they haven't figured out what hobbies they'd want, what social circle they'd want. So many people have their social interaction primarily at work now. So there are two instances where I've seen what you've described. Once again, one is retiring not by choice, and two, retiring from something as opposed to retiring to something. So leaving
Yeah.
that job because it felt like the time was right, but then not knowing what you're doing with yourself.
Yeah. I mean, slowly dipping your toes in the water is definitely the theme here. Just test driving it out, seeing what it's going to be like, because you'll really find value in that. And maybe you might find something that you weren't thinking you were going to do in retirement that is something that's going to be a big part of it. That's extremely important. And just seeing what life will be like. And it'll also give you a good gauge on what your expenses would look like and who you're going to be spending time with and what it really looks like. Just making that transition as easy as possible is definitely beneficial here. And that's
yeah, I
something that test driving gives you the opportunity.
Yeah, I think that I highlighted the importance of a lot of different elements there, Adrian, about what you're test driving. I just want to zero in on one of those, not because it's the only important one, but it is the one that I think is the biggest adjustment for some people, and that is test drive the income. Pardon me, test drive the spending level that you're would be sustainable once you do retire. Because
Hmm.
if you're, I have a it's frequent. I'm sure you've had this as well, gentlemen, where you'll have someone come in and they'll talk with you, and you'll kind of go through their picture financially to understand kind of where they're at. And of course, you haven't done a financial plan yet. You're sitting down with them for the first time and just kind of hearing the kind of overarching details. And what you're sort of thinking in the back of your mind is wait a second, you have saved really only this amount, and you're wanting to retire at fill in the blank 60, 62, and you're telling me that right now you're barely able to get your spending under about $100,000 a year. So do the math. If unless you take social security right away, which is inadvisable, and I would say for most people, not all, but for most people, unless you take that social security right away, you're going to essentially consume all of those savings based on what you've told me in about 2, 3, 4 years time. There won't be anything left. So to make the equation work, you'd have to be living on, let's say, I'm just making up a number now, 25% less per month than you're currently spending. Do you think that's doable? Well, yeah, of course. Okay, if you're confident about that, that's a big adjustment. If you're so confident you can do that, why don't you take that spending plan for a test drive for a year, and then let's talk in 1 year's time, and let's talk about then if you indeed still believe that's workable.
So Eric, let me ask: you've had this conversation before.
Hmm.
How's it gone? Fast forward a year with this person, or did they hear you tell them this and maybe never came back because they weren't able to do it for a year, or what happened?
in most cases, I never see them again. And I think it's in part because maybe I'm just a really rude person to even raise that. And so I was going to use a little stronger term than person there for just a second. I thought, no, this is a family show. So, but instead, I think what happened is that they just were so sort of, I think, dismayed by this thought that maybe this sort of the broad contours of what they've imagined will work is in the minds, at least, of somebody who sees this day in and day out for hundreds of people, is that it's not a very good plan. I think that's just so fundamentally discouraging to them that they don't at least want to talk with me, the bearer of that slightly bad news, or that at least that personal challenge again. So it's a very difficult conversation to have, but it's one, and I don't say it's a frequent one, but I would say every year or two, uh, um, I'll have to have that conversation with someone, or at least feel like that's the right thing to do with that person. Just start with a whole new reframing of the reality. Do you guys run into that?
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean,
the
presenting the data is just really good, just to help them make informed decisions. Just you want to kind of look at your overall situation, and sometimes it takes a tough conversation. And I guess that must have been a tough conversation because you said you didn't really see him much after that. So just giving them, laying out all the options so they can make an informed decision, or at least have it in the back of their pocket, is just better than not knowing at all and just test driving it and kind of just behind the wheel blindfolded is never really something that we'd ever really advise.
Yeah, Eric, I've had one specific situation that comes to mind where I met with a plastic surgeon making over $1 million a year.
Mm-hmm.
If I remember correctly, just turning 50, was about to throw a big 50th birthday bash. Spent $1 million a year, and only asset to speak of was the equity in their multi-million-dollar home.
Mm-hmm.
And their game plan was, by the time I retire, I'll pay off the home, I'll sell it, and then I will live off of the proceeds. But that would involve, I think, if I remember correctly, that would involve cutting their spending by like 65%.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, and this was exact same experience as you, where I never met with them again. We used to joke when I started in the business. We used to say they entered the witness protection program because you'd never see or hear from them again after
Okay.
that.
All right. Good line.
Yeah, appreciate you sharing that. I just want to bring us back to a term that I brought up. This could be its own episode, but I'm just curious. Have you two been to a retirement party and have any like cool or fun stories that you want to share? I've seen some as extreme as people getting caught on fire by the celebration cake, and some as just cringe as poorly timed speeches that really should have been said in private. So anything memorable from a retirement party? I've never been to one, so if you want to invite me one, I'd be happy to come. But just kind of want to see what it's like.
Adrian's going to get all these invitations on the website now. Please come to my retirement party, which would be fun. But I've got no embarrassing stories. I've been to a few, and they've all been exactly what you'd expect from a retirement
Yeah.
party.
I'm assuming just good food, some speeches, just catching up, just a little bit of reflection here and there, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, exactly.
Adrian, even if I had some embarrassing stories to tell, do you think I'd be well advised to tell those stories about my clients?
I mean, it doesn't have to be embarrassing. Maybe somebody's listening right now and they want to have a retirement party. So they're like, what can I do to make sure that this is the best send off I can have going into this new phase of my life? So it could be either one, but
Just
it doesn't
monitor
have to be funny. I was just curious.
just monitor a little bit who's had what to drink before they get the microphone. That's all I'll say.
That's
That's always a good point.
That's very telling. Eric has these stories that he won't say on camera. We need to bug him off camera.
Maybe. I mean, it's also, I could maybe apply that to my upcoming wedding as well.
Absolutely.
So I'll keep that noted as well.
Yeah, that'd be a good idea. If Eric tries to give a speech, monitor what he's been drinking first.
Noted. All right. All right. So I'm going to bring us on to
I
the
love
last
you,
one that I want
man.
to present. I appreciate it, Eric. I'll be like, that's my podcast host guy right there. This is the side of him I've never seen before.
You won't see that side of me, but who knows? No, I should leave some ambiguity about that. So keep the risk element in the spirit of the conversation we're having today.
So tell your groomsmen if Erik goes for the mic to tackle him.
All right. And I'll let the DJ know as well because he'll be supplying the mics.
Okay,
Cut the mic off.
great. See that guy over there? No mic.
Awesome.
Adrian,
So I'm going to bring us on to our last topic that I have today. And this Erik kind of touched on as well. And Roshan, I think you kind of mentioned this as well when you're talking about that plastic surgeon who made $1 million a year. So this is try to avoid setting a certain number or amount that will allow you to be financially independent without creating a plan. And I'm just going to dive a little bit deeper in this. Yes, it's good to have goals and targets in mind. That's something that we always like to hear when it comes, especially when it comes to planning. But it's even better when you have goals and targets in mind when they're supported by a customized plan that's tailored to you. So this is really something that's really important because you want to identify your goals and create a plan other than just assuming some number that you looked up or you heard from or something that you think is just going to be the overarching thing that if you hit this number, you'll be fine. So it's really taking assumption out of it and really just sticking to a plan or just having a conversation just to see how you can just achieve this goal, because this is just extremely important because things change over time. Expenses change. How long you work will change. That's different for everybody. And the future really isn't guaranteed to anybody. So it's really important to really plan and see all the different risks and scenarios that can play out that can really impact these goals and these targets that you have in mind. It's really important because also something that we touched on before, your investments are going to be a really important factor for you to achieve these goals as well. So you want to kind of plan that out as well. And there's a whole bunch of factors that play into this. But when you have a goal or a target in mind, create a plan that's customized to you other than maybe using some rule of thumbs or assumptions, just so you're prepared for the worst. And if you're not, you can have a better outcome. And that's something that's really valuable here.
I love that one too. What comes to mind for me when you say that is you've got to figure out the reason for your goal. So what you had said, Adrian, was having a goal is a good thing, but it's gotta mean something besides just an arbitrary random number, right? And I see two risks with having a random number. One, what if that number is wrong? What if you say I need X to retire and that's not enough? The other risk I see, even if that random number is adequate, is that is a situation where I think the likelihood of that person retiring, going back to work, is higher, just because they had a goal, they hit that goal, and now what, right? So now they've got that number, they can retire if they want, but I think they'd have a little bit of trouble figuring out what they want to do with themselves. So when I say figure out the why, if you're someone that wants to move and retire to the beach, how much do you need to make that move and retire and go to the beach and live there forever? I think that's a better goal than even if it's the same number. Let's just say that number's $5 million. I'm totally picking it because it's an easy round number. Let's say you're person A where you say, all right, I need 5 million to retire. And let's assume that's the correct number. And person B's, I need 5 million so I can move to the beach and live there and enjoy that. I think person B is likely to stay retired, more likely than person A, who just had a number and not a reason for why.
Yep, and just understanding the risk and stuff that can knock you off track. And that's just the value of planning, just seeing what can go wrong and what could go wrong, and just knowing everything in between is just very valuable. And it's just even more important, what I say, creating a customized plan that's tailored to you, because maybe there's somebody out there that has a similar goal and you're trying to following the same path that they took, and you think this might be achievable for you, but things change all the time. There's a lot of variabilities when it comes to life. So just kind of knowing everything that can get in the way of this is extremely important.
Also of note, sometimes people are fearful of having these goals or these targets because they're worried that it is going to change. And I would say it will change, right? From what I've seen with clients, whether it's when they've retired, they thought they want to travel all the time and realized it was too much. They plan to live in one part of the country and something happened in their life where they're in a different part. So I think expect this to be a journey and an adventure as opposed to going exactly as you planned
Exactly. Just like you said, it might not go as you planned it, but if you're prepared for it, if you plan for it, you probably know how to maybe go into another direction or how to maybe make some adjustments just to stay on track. Where if you don't really have a plan, like I mentioned earlier, if you're kind of behind the wheel with blindfold on right now, it's really hard for you to hit those targets or those goals. So just try and look at the data, create a balance sheet, have a conversation, look at your investments, see everything that you have that can help you achieve this goal and this target, and then you make those adjustments and then continue to monitor that and track it is also just extremely important because plans change as well, just as your goals and targets change. So there's a lot of variability. So that's something that you really need to key in on if you want to hit this certain target or goal you have in mind because it changes a lot.
Yeah, I believe change is certainly a big part of it. The one thing that I think, and anticipating that change and doing the planning, of course, I sound self-serving that we're saying this, of course, because we're planners, but I mean, it is, we see over and over the mistaken impressions or the unrealistic expectations oftentimes that good planning can correct, and sometimes that incidentally those the expectations that it corrects, good planning corrects, is very what I'll say small expectations. And when people see through the planning process that indeed the combination of the Social Security, potentially the pensions, the other resources that they have, and what have you, that those things actually work together in a pretty effective way for them, they're surprised. And I think, by the way, just on that note as an aside, the planning part, good planning at least, it's also highly attentive to long term, lifetime tax reduction strategies is even more potent in this respect. Insofar as the IRS gets less, you have more. But there is the opposite side, and that is sometimes when I hear people name a number and they're saying, "I don't really need to do any sort of planning. I've got this number in mind." Then, if you just probe a little bit and you find out what assumption they have about the growth that they're going to see in their portfolio until they retire, and how much that growth will continue to supply them during their retirement, you kind of scratch your head. How did you develop that expectation? I don't know about you guys, but I often hear people say, "I'm going to be making 10% on my portfolio," right? Possibly. That is, it's, I suppose that is possible. But if you're assuming that that will
but it
necessarily
wouldn't
be the
plan on it.
case and it'll be uniform from year to year, and that there won't be any inflation and you won't have any taxes and there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then maybe, yeah, that 10% per year growth rate idea that you have will work. But, but maybe you should test that a little bit. So, that's why I think sort of false assumptions or faulty assumptions are often, if faulty assumptions are behind the number you've selected, that's really the problem. It's not the number itself. It's the grossly incomplete set of assumptions, as well as in some case the outright just completely unrealistic assumption.
Yeah, completely agree with you there too. You've got to go through it. That reminds me to share with our listeners, if you're a newer listener to us, our second season we talk about financial planning and assumptions you can use.
Mhm.
Reminds me, Eric, last year I had a call with someone referred to me by an accountant, and he I didn't have a follow up with him because he said to me, "I want something low risk to return 15% a year." And my response was, I'm not aware of such a thing. And it's interesting because you get these things that are anecdotal in my mind, signals that we're at the peak, because I had conversations like that in 2000 as
Mhm.
well. Yeah, just give me something that's low risk and does just 15% a year every year without moving up and down very much. And it shows a lack of experience and
Mhm.
knowledge in the
Mhm.
space. And then when you try to explain it to them, I find that sometimes that's like, I've got this injury, like bang your head against the wall, because you're not going to get anywhere.
Well, Adrian,
Excellent, guys. I really liked it, Adrian. The three topics, if we can just summarize them again and tell me if I get it wrong. The first one is risk. The second one was the fact that people are retiring and then going back to work, about a third of the retirees. And then the last one was making sure you've got a plan in place. Correct?
Yep. You got them all right, Roshan. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect, perfect. I was paying attention, as you can tell. So, and we've got good tips for
Appreciate it.
everyone in there. Yeah, we'll be back next week with another great episode. Please like, subscribe, give us 5 stars, tell your friends and family about us, and share the links. You can check out the website at retirementlifestyleshow.com. And thank you for listening.